Horror is home to several villains. Less discussed are its heroes. Sure, horror has no shortage of survivors and those who strive to continue on, but from its beginning, from its very inception, horror has had monster hunters, those who fight to keep what's dear to them alive. It's had scholars, those who study the arcane and enigmatic, and it has had survivors who take the next step forward to protect those around them. I feel like these heroes of horror aren't discussed nearly enough, though they are essential to the experience of watching a good scary story. So naturally, I felt it was time to give them the respect that they deserve. But I didn't go at this one alone.
Sure. My name's Ashley, or Ash for short. My pronouns are she, they.
I'm Steven. I go by Poltergeist Steve on social media, most handles. I think I'm still on X, formerly Twitter or whatever. But, primarily our YouTube channel, Voices from the Mausoleum. Me and my co-host Angel, it's a bit of a variety channel.
Hi, Chrystal Williams. I co-host the podcast Gals of Geekdom, and I'm a writer and a longtime friend and collaborator with Ant over here.
Yeah, well, you were the first people I thought of when I was thinking of this project, quite frankly. When you think of a hero in a horror movie, what do you think of? Not as like a person, but like certain qualities you think a horror hero should have.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think of like a horror hero, right? Because we're not looking at it through a lens that we would look at like a superhero, right? The Superman figure of like 100%, you're fully altruistic, you're just in it to save people. Because a lot of our main characters in horror are usually, down and out, in it for themselves sometimes. There's some central character flaw that we're looking to see sort of manipulated and put to the test. And, we also might think of the final girl as a sort of the hero trope. Sort of your, Girl Scout kind of character. And while that might actually have a lot in common with superhero traits, right, as far as like someone who's really looking out for others, super selfless, that's actually changed a lot in the last 20 some odd years, where we see a lot of main characters in horror actually have flaws, and who aren't supposed to be these pillars of society. So we see a real shift in that from, I would say, maybe in the 90s. We see a real shift with that, maybe starting with like Sidney Prescott, and like certainly the I Know What You Did Last Summer crew. I mean, their whole thing was they killed somebody and they kept it a secret for you, right? So really the 90s and sort of, I think, the boom of like the teen soap changed a lot of these archetypes that we see.
It makes a lot of sense. Because again, they focus more on the interior flaws of characters. And I think if you compare someone like, say, Nancy Thompson from Nightmare on Elm Street to Sidney Prescott, you see even though they're both Wes Craven characters, there's such like a different type of character, a different type of focus, more internalized drama as much as externalized with Sidney and Know You Did Last Summer and all that.
I think like a distinction between like there's so many different tropes. Like there's a final girl trope, right? And then there's like the horror hero, which I think in its purest form can sometimes be like harder to like parse through. Some horror heroes can be heroes based on like the length of time that they've been in like said franchise, and they basically become heroes just because of their trauma. Or there's also the horror heroes who are kind of like superheroes in their own right.
There are a lot of horror protagonists that find themselves thrown into the danger and are forced to work their way out in order to survive, because I mean that's our instinct to survive. But like a true horror hero is someone who has gone through trauma, has gone through all this danger, and has decided, I'm not going to let anyone go through this horrible thing again. And I will actively work to stop this danger or this horror or whatever.
What do you think like the first major horror hero was.
I mean, it depends on how far back are we going, like a Van Helsing kind of character, right?
Oh
Like,
yeah.
yeah, like I mean, that's one of the OGs, I would say, right? You know, your hero coming in, you know, taking care of the vampires, sure.
I will find your earth box and drive that stake through your heart.
Would you think it's safe to say that, like, over time the horror hero became more vulnerable? Because based on how we were describing it, you start with your Van Helsings. You start with your figures of great strength and knowledge, and they know all about this ancient lore, and they help the characters out. And then you have your final girls, and then you have your more teen drama-oriented protagonists. And it seems like they got more vulnerable the more audience became familiar with the horror tropes.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look where we are now with like A24 horror, right? That's all about deep psychological trauma and strife and really challenging. I mean, it's Midsommar and I guess all about grief and letting go of your pain. You look at you know, Hereditary and really tackling like these internal sort of familial pains. Yeah, so I think for sure. I mean, I'm even looking at like a newer hit like well, Talk to Me was also A24. And a lot of the stuff that tackled. I think there's a lot of vulnerability there as well.
Lady, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the store.
So Ashley J. Williams, the protagonist of the Evil Dead franchise, arguably starts out as a final girl himself. At least fitting that trope, right? In the first Evil Dead, he is a man who is very cowardly in the first film, but like understandably so. By the he's like the last quote unquote survivor, but through the course of the Evil Dead franchise, he transitions from final girl into basically foretold hero, but in a way that's not essentially like your typical sort of way. He's very much comedic horror hero, but I would argue that he is kind of like a superhero in a sense. It's what keeps him distinct from a lot of the other heroes in the horror franchises, because like he has, I mean, he's kind of like prophesized and foretold to be this hero. And I would argue that if you watch his movies, and especially if you watch Ash vs. Evil Dead, his main power is just dumb luck.
Yeah. And when you watch Ash versus Evil Dead, he kind of got himself into that situation when he read from the book while he was high off his ass. But he does actively work to stop it.
That is true. Now, Ash, obviously you have some. You're obviously a fan of Ash, given
I am
the everything. Why?
Yes.
Why do you like this character so much?
I feel like it's because, like, when I was a kid, he had like my goofy sense of humor. Like, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. No, definitely does.
And like, I always found myself latched onto these himbo type characters.
I get that.
Like, I'm a sucker for them.
Each film, while they are kind of connecting, feel distinct in a ways, because there's things changed between each one that makes it like a loose sequel, I suppose. So his personality does change per film, which is interesting because like first film, just the guy surviving. Evil Dead 2 kind of gets a bit more goofier, but by the end he has to take on the mantle. And then by Army of Darkness, it's just full up, straight up comedy and like this sort of not giving a shit attitude, which makes him kind of a bad guy, but like a good guy at the same time, if that makes sense. Like he is a deeply flawed protagonist.
So you know, one idea I had with why each film just does not connect to each other continuity-wise that much is because I'd like to think it's Ash telling the story to the viewer, but his perspective becomes increasingly goofier as he inserts more of himself into the narrative, if that makes sense. He
He
tries, and that's what
fails. He fails, but he also does succeed. I mean, it's through like bumbling about it, and not to say that there aren't casualties around him, but like he still does succeed in the end, just through, like I said, his main superpower is literally just kind of luck. Like, I it's never really like directly addressed in the show or anything, but like he just like trips into winning scenarios or surviving.
some people would argue that like he does what he does merely to feed his own ego because he is, let's be honest, a very egotistical man.
Mm.
Like he's
Um,
very full of himself.
Oh, he's not the most
But-
lovable
kind
person
of-
in the room, huh?
Also, kind
But,
of, if you follow
like-
the Ash vs. Evil Dead, he's a little misogynistic and racist at times.
Yeah, that guy. But like there are moments, particularly in the TV show, where you can see that he cares about the friends that he makes along the way, like Kelly and Pablo and Amanda and such.
Mm.
He cares about people for sure. He's just an idiot.
Yeah, and towards the end of Ash versus Evil Dead, when he sends his daughter away, like that moment actually really got me in the feels because I feel like it's Ash fighting for someone other than himself.
Look at the difference between Ash from Evil Dead and Mia from the remake.
Oh yeah, 100%.
So huge difference, right? Where you just sort of have like this bumbling, like all American idiot, and then Mia, who's like really struggling with like this, with addiction, right? And the whole movie is her overcoming this and going through withdrawal and really coming out the other side. I mean, literally taking down not only her addiction but the demons that are also outside of her.
Yeah, her own inner demons in a sense too, because she gets possessed by them, overtaken by them.
I mean, they ran that theme throughout that whole movie.
I mean, you look at people. I know people who saw that movie and they were like, "I don't get why Mia is an addict. I don't get why she's overcoming the heroin addiction." And like, if you've ever known someone who struggled with addiction, when they're going through the throes of withdrawal, like they're basically seem like they're possessed. Like they act like totally different people in some cases because that. The need is so intense and so overpowering to them that they act unreasonable or desperate.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, lying to family, stealing. I mean, all behaviors that they otherwise, without the addiction, would never just fall into.
Yeah, and they're horrified by afterwards. I feel like that. I feel like people kind of sleep on, even people who like the Fede Alvarez Evil Dead movie. I feel like they sleep on the really intense themes it's grappling with. Like, there's a lot of depth to that film I think people overlook just in favor of like the licking the knife and stapling people's faces open and all that, and the chainsaw like to the face.
Oh man, I mean, listen, yes, all the gore is incredible in that movie, but just to take this idea of the inner demon, this this addiction being the demon that she has to withdraw from, take full, just kind of give to this demon and then overcome it, like quite literally and figuratively, to come out the other side. And meanwhile, all her supports are dropping left and right. It's just her, which is often how it can feel.
No, agreed.
Mia is excellent. She's the main protagonist of Evil Dead 2013. She is there at the cabin because she's trying to get off drugs, and her friends are there to help her. And it's a very, very clever setup because when the horror starts, everyone just immediately assumes that it's due to her drug withdrawal. But then it becomes apparent that it is very much not that. And Mia does become a Deadite, but then by the end, she reverts to human and becomes the hero of the story.
The allegory of trying to bring someone back from a drug addiction and hurting those around you is kind of very on the nose, but it's very pertinent. And I think that's what makes the 2013 Evil Dead really an interesting film. I wouldn't necessarily call her on the level of like quote unquote hero like Ash becomes. I but she's not exactly like your typical final girl. I feel like she's somewhere in the middle. I find that interesting because like I was trying to explain earlier, there's a distinction between like the concept of like a horror hero and like just a typical sort of final girl. Like a final girls can do heroic things, but that doesn't distinctly mark them as like a hero, like worthy of being like someone that is as iconic as the killers in the franchises, if that makes sense.
One obvious example would be Nancy from the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Well, obviously, the first film, she's just like a simple high school student who, is, and she and her friends are seeing this guy in their dreams. And when they start dying one by one, Nancy comes up with a plan to get him out after she figures out how to do that. And then when we see her in Dream Warrior, she is actively helping these kids with special powers in their dreams try to try to defeat Freddy Krueger.
And she's trying to save other kids, so that's kind of heroic.
I think that too, and what I think is interesting too with Nancy is, and you see this a lot with the horror movie final girls who come back for sequels. They always have like this, they're grizzled, they're disturbed, they're upset, they're traumatized. But like with Nancy, what I think is so compelling about her character is that she comes back with her baggage, with her pain, and has channeled it into something that's so productive for society, going out to help people who are dealing with struggles on their own. It's so selfless and so motivated to benefit others from this trauma.
Exactly. Yeah. And one sad example that I can think of is Andy Barclay from the Child's Play series. He was a 6-year-old boy when he first encountered Chucky. Like, imagine dealing with something like that when you're 6 years old. But Andy Barclay has been through so much. I always feel so sad for him. His mom got taken away from him. He got put into a foster family whose parents hated him. Like, Kyle didn't hate him. She cared about him, but the foster parents didn't really care about him. He got put into military school. He's a pariah, and yet he still actively works to get rid of Chucky once and for all, once he hears he's back.
I'm thinking of two other examples that are very iconic if you're talking about the final girl who becomes kind of forced into her heroic role. Laurie Strode and Sidney Prescott.
Laurie Strode. Because this is an interesting one, right? Because obviously, which Laurie Strode are we talking about? Because the Halloween, as we all know, the Halloween franchise is just riddled with timeline splits and alternate versions. So Laurie Strode, I think, is a phenomenal hero in the sense that, while she isn't necessarily, like, say, in the original 1978 film, 78, 79, I don't know.
Something like that.
She, what does she call? She says the Girl Scout comes through again. And I mean, she is the Girl Scout in this. She is looking out for the kids. And she's certainly I remember watching this also as a young person, and this is the same time I've gotten to another film, which I don't want to spoil my other hero here, but I really connected to Laurie just sort of as like this maternal figure, and I think every kid sort of wants to see those qualities in like their mom in some ways. Like, she's going to do for you what you need her to do if the boogeyman is coming for you on Halloween night, and she kept those kids alive, and that was just through just being direct but nurturing and just strong and all these amazing cool qualities. She's supportive of her friends, even though maybe she couldn't quite necessarily save them. But she came through to her friends, right? She was sort of the yes girl in the group. Whatever her friends needed, she came through. And so there's a little bit of that selflessness, and I think that's also probably shows that's part of her arc in the movie too, right? And that's something that people don't really talk about in that original Halloween film, is like, she's very selfless at the very beginning, and so for her to really maybe she's not being selfish by the end, but she's certainly taking a stand for herself by the end of the movie, and so she has to fight for herself and not just say yes to everyone around her. So this sort of arc, right, this sort of hero's journey that she goes through, right, of maybe it's not the classic Star Wars hero's journey, but this idea of selflessness to a fighter.
Yeah.
At the end.
And almost like, I think also a little bit of like a pushover almost too, to an extent too. Like kind of standing your ground against those who are like kind of taking advantage of you or pushing against you. And I think honestly, that element of her arc works so much better when it's just Michael Myers is some outside entity and not like the sibling. It's not like a destined battle.
Oh, I
It's like,
know.
no, he's
Yeah.
just a guy who just shows up, and it's like, now you gotta deal with it. As opposed to like, no, it was meant to be. I think is so ridiculous. I'm glad. Another reason I like the new trilogy quite a lot is because they get rid of that whole
They got the
angle.
silly brother arc, and yet they still were able to. And I mean, we can get to the new trilogy now too, because this is a completely different arc, right? This is someone who is struggling with her trauma, her alcohol dependence, how it's generationally affected her family. So this is again, so totally different character than we see in the 70s. And this is someone who has really negatively impacted her daughter and granddaughter at this point because of it. And so seeing that, right, hero really at their lowest, right? And so we might actually see a lot of parallels here to like a story like this, say The Last Jedi.
I'd say Last Jedi. I'd also say like even like with the Terminator movies with Sarah Connor later on. Like a lot of those
Absolutely.
movies have that same arc where the hero is, I don't want to say broken by trauma because that sounds like so negative, but weighed down by the pain they experience and their lives are taken off course.
The weight of having to be a hero. I mean, I think about like just in our own life, right? Like our first responders and people who have to carry like the weight of like, I don't know, I think I'm a New Yorker and you're in New Jersey. I mean,
Yeah,
we were
all the
9/11.
time.
I mean, like,
Oh
the
God, yeah.
trauma carried from being heroes that day.
Even just secondhand seeing the skyline shifting, from that event. So that, like, where we are in New Jersey, you drive down, I-80, you pass by the New York skyline all the time. When I was a kid, you'd see the two towers there. And I remember, like, one day, obviously, it was after a few days after 9/11, we just drive past that same way and we just see a cloud where buildings were. And it's still a trauma that was still. I think people who say they've gotten over that trauma are lying to themselves. They just haven't processed it yet. But like even in Halloween, they explore that trauma with other characters as well. Loomis starts to lose his mind a little bit by the time you get to 5. Uh, Jamie is like completely ravaged as a human being by the time you get to Curse of Michael Myers, figuratively and literally.
Loomis is an interesting character. I am a firm defender of the producer's cut of Halloween 6.
Yeah,
Because you get this really cool gothic ending to Loomis, who is just consumed by his responsibility to care and protect the world against Michael.
mm-hmm.
And that becomes his curse. Like the curse of Michael is really at that point the curse on Loomis, right?
Yeah.
And I think when you look at the layers in that sense, and where like heroism can become an obsession.
And how like he's finally in that movie, he finally seems like he's getting away from Michael. Like he's gotten the plastic surgery to hide the scars that Donald Pleasance probably couldn't even endure putting on his face at that point.
Yeah, right.
And it's kind of another added layer of cosmic tragedy that was Pleasance's last role. Like he passed away like shortly after they finished filming Halloween 6.
Yep. I believe they were able to put the dedication on the end for him too, right?
Yeah, I believe so. So it's like almost like a cosmic irony to all this that it became his life and ultimately became, for many people, the role that defined Donald Pleasance. Even though he was like a Shakespearean actor, he was Blofeld, but for many people he's Loomis. Like as lingering on past all that, So
And he plays it off well. I mean, it very much plays like a Shakespearean tragedy at the end of 6, or like this big Greek tragedy, right? Where it's just all the themes sort of running through, and like his greatest strength becomes his greatest weakness and takes him down, right?
Agreed. If only Paul Rudd was better in that movie. He's so cheesy in that movie. I do enjoy Halloween 6, but he's so hammy in that.
Laurie is interesting too because she's a shut-in. If we're going to take the timeline of events that continue into the 2018 Halloween, at least in 2018, I wouldn't consider her directly a hero per se, but her intentions were to do better for them. So
True, I
think
guess.
there was good intentions, but also her own trauma made her cold, especially with her own family. I think what has a lot to do with that is the fact that Aliens is as much horror or science fiction action as it is horror.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like, I feel like they Cameron really did a good job putting her in that like role that like established her as like a badass. You
100%.
know, like not to say that she wasn't a badass in the first film, but she was a survivor badass, right?
It's Tangina Barons from Poltergeist.
There we go.
And I am biased, right? It's my favorite. If people, I've got a Poltergeist tattoo. I've got Poltergeist stuff behind me. My handle everywhere is Poltergeisty. I mean, I've pretty much branded my life on this movie.
Yeah, I was gonna say the moment you said your favorite movie, like, wait, Poltergeist. Okay, let's see where this is going. What are you?
Yeah. So Tangina, I think, is an incredible character. She doesn't get a lot of screen time in the first movie, but when you look at the trilogy as a whole, it is very interesting to see where they take her character and the role that she plays in Carol Ann's life.
Mm.
And she really becomes this surrogate mother to her, in a way, this protector. So where Tangina shines in the original, I think, is where what Spielberg in the writing is doing is he's really looking at the suburban facade. This idea of like the white picket fence, typical like white American family. They're always falling asleep in front of the Star Spangled Banner, right? It's all like pure Americana. And then their daughter is taken from the unknown, right? And so this family has to figure out how to explain to people how to get help when they themselves don't know. And you see, like, the mom doesn't really quite take the supernatural threat seriously in the beginning. It's a little funny. They're, doing parlor tricks in the kitchen and whatever, and then as typical Spielberg goes, have reverence for what you don't understand. Otherwise, it's going to come and bite you in the butt. Tangina plays an interesting role here because she comes in to challenge the family's perceptions on the suburban life. She's all these sort of like nuclear family American ideals. She comes in to challenge that. I love the speech at the end. It's a very simple line, but will you do? Now I'm going to misquote it. Of course, now I'm going to say it, but like, will you do what I say even if it comes in contrary to your beliefs as a human being and a Christian? And she does this whole spiel about the beast. And I think as the metaphor here is, we have to be willing to challenge our perceptions and our assumptions of the world around us in order to be able to change and make change happen. And so this role that she plays, she's a hero in the sense, like, yes, she's going and they're making a plan, they're going to get Carol Ann back, but she's also changing this family and making them understand, like, the world is not what you think it is. And in order to be able to survive in it, you have to be willing to change and grow. And so I just love that message of the movie, and I think Tangina perfectly encapsulates that idea. And so we're looking at a hero in a different way, not just someone who saves people literally, but someone who comes in as the vehicle for the message of the film itself and changes people on, I guess we could say, a spiritual.
And I think it's interesting what you're saying, too, about how you have to experience things outside your comfort zone, outside the realms of your belief. Because horror, I feel, is so often pressing up against those great unknowns, those great questions. And the source of horror often is not knowing.
Yeah.
I think if you're going to be like a major figure of hope in a horror film or a force of salvation, it helps to kind of accept that there are things that are outside your control and to get to push forward anyway. I think that element's very important, and it's something that I think a lot of these characters we would consider heroes kind of there's an overlap with, I'd say.
Yeah.
But as the films go on, obviously the first Poltergeist is a classic. I'm interested to see how you feel she fits in with the later two as well, in terms of
I think she sort of gets sidelined in the second one a bit, right? Because we have now I'm blanking. Hold on, while I get the.
Yeah, I'm assuming that referring to the vomit monster.
Yeah, I enjoy this. I believe me. I know that this 2 and 3 are probably not as up to snuff as that original. That original is a classic.
But it's kind of hard to compare any sequel to a masterpiece like that. Is the thing.
Yes. But we have Taylor. I couldn't remember his first name, but Taylor. He's the medicine man. So he sort of takes the Tangina role. So who Tangina was really to the mom in the first one, Taylor really is to the dad in the second one. Tangina continues to be sort of this maternal figure, even to Diane, because Diane loses her mom in the second one. And so, I think of like, with my parents whose their parents have passed away, right? What that feeling might be. I think I'm a young father, I have a 2-year-old, and I still lean on my parents to take, to help me with my son or for advice or some guidance in some way. So this idea of then losing sort of this generational pillar, right? And the grandmother in this movie is just like, she's your quintessential Hollywood grandma. I mean,
The
so
vibe is
loving.
just there.
Yeah. So this idea that Tangina comes in as this motherly figure to Diane and helps her, who a woman in her like late 30s, 40s, coming to her own abilities, right? Because we find out that Diane and Carol Ann have spiritual psychic tendencies, which connect them to the other side, and so you're adding some lore here, but so you have Taylor and Steve, and then you have Tangina and Diane. So I think she continues that now. Where they really drive it home is in the third one, where now Carol Ann is completely not abandoned, right? But
Not there.
The parents aren't there.
No.
And so this is obviously a big issue I have with the third one, but I do love this exploration, especially having a son who's adopted. This idea of being within a surrogate family of sorts, right? So she's with her cousins and her aunt and uncle, and her aunt isn't even her biological aunt. I think she came in much later in life. It's really her uncle is Diane's cousin, I believe. And then the aunt comes in later, and then she has her cousin from, I believe, the dad's first marriage. I think it's all about blended family, because you have two people from one, the father and daughter, then you have Carol Ann from the cousins, and then the new wife. So you have a whole blended family situation, and then you have Tangina, who is sort of this familiarity that comes in, and she can sense that Carol Ann's in danger again. And so and leading to like this ultimate sacrifice, where she says, Cain's not going to stop coming after you. I've done everything I can, but this one thing, I'm going to do that for you. And she steps in, and just selflessly gives her life so that Carol Ann can have hers. Yeah, as a whole, these films, and we are again not as best written or written as best as the original. It's cool to see that trajectory with Tangina.
I'm going to throw out Martin Brody from Jaws.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
All right.
that's true.
He is one of my absolute favorite horror heroes, because think about it. He is the police chief on an island that he's not. He wasn't born in. He hasn't lived in for very long, so he's kind of a newcomer. He is afraid of water, afraid of like going in the water, and he has to face off against a gigantic shark. And he does it. He kills the shark. Like, that is amazing character development in just 2 hours. That he overcomes his fear to kill this shark.
It's Spielberg, really, right? I mean, like...
Yeah, as his boat is sinking, how about Danny Torrance?
Oh, and especially in Doctor Sleep. Even in The Shining,
exactly.
Doctor Sleep especially.
That's exactly the point I'm trying to make. In The Shining, he is another kid who is thrown into horror that he can't comprehend. And in the sequel, Doctor Sleep, he understands his shining powers better, and he uses them for good, and he uses it to comfort dying people.
One we haven't talked about is Tommy Jarvis.
Tommy Jarvis.
Tommy Jarvis, yes. The closest Jason Voorhees ever had to an archenemy. Tommy Jarvis killed Jason, and then he brought him back.
You ever see The Crow?
I wish the rain would stop just once.
Can't rain all the time.
The Crow. My mind doesn't immediately go to that film as kind of like like necessarily like a horror experience, but I totally get that it fits the aesthetic and vibes. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's uh, it's like an action revenge story, but told through the softest of lenses, and I mean that in a good way, where um the focus of that film is on emotions and grief and kind of picking yourself up and moving forward with a couple of like action sequences like in the middle and stuff like that. But I think that that film is far more it's interesting. That's like but it is a great choice. Eric Draven, Brandon Lee's performance in that is incredible.
All right, so we got one left. Who's
We got
your
one left.
who's your peak?
It's Ellen Ripley, baby.
Get away from her, you bitch!
Ripley, I mean, namely Ripley in 1 and 2. I mean, I am, with 3, I have lots of gripes with 3, but I think with 1 and 2, it's interesting. She's the surprise hero, right? Which is, we don't see a lot of this in newer films where, if you're watching Alien for the first time and you have no idea who Ellen Ripley is, you don't know much about the story, you're not expecting what's in the sequels, if you go in blind, you wouldn't think she was the main character.
No, yeah. Honestly, the way the film works, you either think Dallas or Ash even are going to be the main character. The way they frame those characters, like even late into the film, you think they're going to be the central figure because Ripley is like kind of like a scutch a little bit. She's a little she's a little bit of a pain in the ass a bit, like a little bit of a rule stickler, and you kind of like, oh, she's going to be the character who like you're meant not to like, but she's the one who's right about everything.
It's very similar to Laurie in the sense where, like, Laurie was a pushover. Ellen Ripley, like you said, it was more of a rigid stickler for the rules, right? Mm-hmm. So it was very different characters, right? One's a little wishy-washy, and she's very, like, on the money, like, this is what we got to do. I'm right about this. I'm right about that. Let's stick to it. To the point where she just has to do whatever, she has to do whatever she can now to survive by the end of it. So she's just sort of like, okay, just, I gotta fight. And so, whether she's breaking the rules or whatever she's got to do. I mean, I guess, think about it, she has to destroy Wayland Yutani property.
Oh, yeah.
So I guess that is an ultimate rule break, right?
I mean, she ends up being a stickler for the rules and then gets, like, when she gets back home, gets reprimanded for destroying a ship and, like, basically loses her job because she had to fight to survive.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's such a good point, too, right? Because sometimes when we do what we have to do, right, people still, wag a finger at us.
Mm-hmm. And what's funny is she goes from, like, being this obedient employee to basically saying, you know what, actually, screw the company. Let's just, she becomes, like, the biggest public enemy number 1 for Wayland Yutani. Like, even into 3, like, for all the faults that 3 has, at least it carries through that through line of an arc, at least.
This daughter arc, right? And that's my biggest gripe with 3 is obviously, they dropped the ball with Newt there.
Oh, yeah.
But this whole context with, like, this missed relationship with her daughter because now she's stuck in, cryo sleep for, was it 50 years?
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
Well, so with the special edition, they include 2 scenes that are really relevant to this discussion. One where they show Newt's family on the planet before they discover, as they discover the facehuggers, and the other where Ripley learns that her daughter died of old age while she was in cryosleep.
Okay, you know what? I think because I turned it on, I didn't realize I was watching the extended cut. But I guess I just always assumed it was the cut, and I forgot. Okay, yes.
Yeah. So that's not included in the theatrical version. They never even mention her daughter. So it's like
I never watched the theatrical now that I think about it because those details have always been there for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny, right? Like you kind of forget, like some cuts, like with Alien 3, the cut differences are more memorable. Like one's a dog that gets impregnated, one's an ox, But with Aliens, some of the key plot points are in the extended cut.
I mean, without that, right? You're not getting that deep emotional arc. And this is also another reason why I gravitate to Ripley as well as say the characters in like Poltergeist, right? This sort of like family dynamic. Now we're not really seeing, say in the original, we're not seeing a child here. But in that second one, you're really seeing that again, surrogate family situation, where she really is looking out for Newt because that's, she sees her daughter in her. And And so this Ripley really is, I guess, a little more in line with what we might consider a classic hero. In the sense of like, she may bounce back because she's sort of thrown, right? She's blamed for the ship destruction. She's, but she ultimately here is doing what's right for other people. It's not so much about her.
Exactly. Yeah.
While she is healing from the loss of her daughter, what she is doing does ultimately serve others.
Exactly, and it's for the good of those around. And that's the thing too, as well. Like in all the movies, she's trying to do the best for everyone around her, even if she exercises some tough love occasionally to all of them. But like with her relationship with Newt, especially, like there's such a maternal, but also such like there's a sense that they both need each other. With Newt needs that maternal figure in her life, and Ripley, who wasn't there for her own daughter, now feels a guilt upon her that she wants to be there for. And it forms again like a found family kind of thing.
Like when I went to see the 40th anniversary of Poltergeist, they did a re-release in theaters. I like sobbed in the theater because it was hitting me on such a different level. And I realized when I got into horror, I was 8, 9 years old. And so what I was connecting to in a lot of these movies was as a kid looking for the protector. When I had watched Poltergeist for the 40th anniversary, I had been a father at that point now for a year or so. And I was like, wow, like I am now in a position where I would go to the other side. I would, take down a xenomorph or whatever I had to do in order to make sure that my son is okay. And it was such a dynamic shift in myself. It was very overwhelming.
But I think that's why these characters are so important, because with horror, I'm not a father, so I can't speak to that experience, though. Who knows what the winds will bring. But like the idea of that though is that horror shifts with its audience, even with the same film. So like what I think a good horror story can do is you can connect to it on some level at any different point when you get into that film. Like some films I've watched when I was younger that I don't connect to anymore because I've simply have just, I don't want to say aged out of the relatability of the film, but I've my perspective shifted where I can no longer fit into that piece of the film like I used to quite right. And there's a few examples of that I can think of. Like some of the Friday the 13th films, for example, I watch and I'm like, oh, I can't see myself in this world right now. And some of them, not so much. I think like 6 and 4 I can, but some of the goofier ones, not so much. But like a film like Poltergeist, like a film like Halloween, like a film like Aliens, those films exist so that they are different angles to see things. You can always see where you came from initially, but now you also have this extra dimension to it that wouldn't have made sense to you previously. Not because your brain couldn't comprehend that it was happening. It's just the emotionality, the emotional connection just didn't interlock yet.
Yeah. Well, it's the difference between sympathy and empathy, right? It's like when you've experienced something that you can see in the character that you're following. That's what you're latching on to. We can sympathize. I don't have to have gone through exactly what you've gone through to sort of feel for you. But if there's something very similar, or if there's something, right? We really can put ourselves in that character's shoes. So I think that emotion connection, like you said, is so important in horror. Here's my spicy take.
This is what I'm pushing for.
I love this character, but I don't think she's the hero that people make her out to be. And that is Sidney Prescott.
Yes.
So, because Sidney Prescott is so wrapped up in the family melodrama, right? That if we're going to talk about heroes, she never really successfully saves anybody.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
You know what I mean? All her friends die. At the point where, in Scream 4, they call her the Angel of Death. So she sort of gets this reputation of, if you know her or you're near her, you will die as a result of that. So I think if we're going to go by definition of hero, I think that discounts Sidney Prescott.
Yeah, and again, her story of being a personal survivor is so compelling. But like, if you're looking at it from the perspective of is she actually stopping any of this from happening? Usually, only when when they're directly targeting her. Like that's when it's like she's able to stop it. When whatever Ghostface killer is like going straight after her. But like,
and it's always a team effort. It doesn't mean her story's not good and not compelling. It is. But that's also because this is a thing I've always said about Scream. It's not just about Sidney Prescott. Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson made a story very much about other things around, in not only just in horror, but in pop culture and society. And those movies are such a bigger message.
She's dealing with so much trauma. Like, let's just put aside what happens in the first film, like the events of the first film with the murders. She's already dealing with past trauma of losing her mother in a brutal, horrible death, right? That's hard for a teenager to comprehend with, which I think is funny that Gail is like the press pushing her. And becomes also another major character in that series. But like, she's just dealing with so much for a teenager. And in a way, she goes from being like, because of that like scar and damage, it's almost like these murderers who keep putting on these masks and doing these horrible crimes around her. She like she makes them afraid of her, like in a way. Like, and I kind of dig that. Do you get what I'm trying to get at?
Oh, 100%.
Except for the Scream 5 killers who idolized her.
With Scream 5 and 6, we open up the door to so many interesting new avenues of a plot. How new people who intersect with this legacy might grow from it. How different people who are tangibly involved with it might have been affected. Like, I forget her name. Kirby was the character's name?
Kirby. Yeah.
Which is fascinating to see that. I love that in Scream 6. Like that that angle of it.
The survivor becoming an agent because of her experience with Ghostface. Yeah.
Like, and totally diverged from everything else that happened in the films. Just her own little arc that's separate from all of that. Like, not continually lingering in the Ghostface saga, but like just on the outskirts of it, which I think is neat and clever. And I wish we saw more of that. And I guess we're getting more Sidney.
We're going backwards again.
Going backwards. Getting Patrick Dempsey showing back up again. It's okay.
Because why not? Because he's not on Grey's anymore. So
no, I mean I don't think Thanksgiving did all that. Thanksgiving did all that well.
So we have this one film I absolutely loved. I saw at the Brooklyn Horror Film Festival last year called The Shade. We had the director and their comic book coordinator, because they have a tie-in comic that they came out with.
Oh, that's cool.
They're going to be donating some stuff for our giveaway. And that film's actually coming out in September. So it'll be out already.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll check out The Shade if you haven't. And we're going to do a giveaway. It's going to include some Shade merch. It's a great film too. We talk about mental health and what that film tackles. It's fantastic. Outside of that, more Coffee Crypt. That's our weekly morning talk show. Where we talk about box office, horror news, whatever, topics of the week. We have our Found Footage Fridays every week, and we have author interviews, filmmaker interviews, video game, play-alongs, and we run, like I said at the beginning, we run the gamut.
And I can vouch they have some good stuff. You should watch and check them out right away.